Hey gang, John here. Quick talk on existential theory, existential therapy. So we've obviously did our readings last semester. We have our demonstration tape. This talk is hopefully going to be quick and provide you guys with an overview that may help to put together some of the ideas that we've looked at from different sources during the current course and the last course. So we'll briefly talk about history, some key developers, what is at the center of existentialism in terms of theoretical foundations, talk about what therapeutic change looks like, what the role might be in rehabilitation, and then very briefly touch on some strengths and weaknesses. So existential philosophy, so we have existential therapy, and existential therapy is born of existential philosophy. Existential philosophy emerged after World War One, is when the ideas first started coming together, and before World War Two, out of people's need to confront and understand the atrocities of World War One, right? Because before World War Two, World War One was not World War One; it was just the World War. So it was really devastating for a lot of folks in terms of their understanding of the world order and the world view. Existentialism tried to wrestle with some of those questions. Given the atrocities of human beings in our difficult history, what is the meaning of life in this new era? This new era being after World War One, as we're kind of waking up to a postmodernism, to a more modern era. So, in terms of existential therapists, some key developers are Viktor Frankl, Rollo May, Irvin Yalom, James Bugental. Bugental is actually the guy who will be giving who's giving the demonstration in our demonstration video. And then Clement von Tress, very interesting, very articulate African-American author and psychologist who comes out of the existential tradition. Looking back to existential philosophy and existential theory, so these are the folks that influenced the people on the previous slide. We have Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Tillich, and Buber. So these are major early existential theorists. Kierkegaard actually precedes a lot of the main action in the development of existentialism, having died in 1855. A lot of people would say he's the father of existentialism. Again, you'll see that these folks predate kind of the broader popularity or broader acknowledgement of existentialism as theory. Nietzsche, most folks are familiar at least with the name, huge influence on modern thinking. Heidegger, one of the most important and original philosophers of the 20th century. Tillich, a German-American Christian existentialist and philosopher. And then Buber, who is an Austrian-born existentialist who did a lot of work on a concept called the I-thou relationship. And that comes up in some of the existential therapy theories as well, or schools of thought within existential therapy. And then there are existential writers, Camus, Sartre, and Kafka. Again, a lot of this work dealing with a lot of the things that humanity was waking up to in the later part of the first fifth of the 1900s. So post-World War II is basically what I'm talking about. Viktor Frankl probably thought of it as the individual who brought existentialism to therapy, born in Vienna, Austria in 1905. You'll see that his pedigree, if you will, fits in with a lot of the psychodynamic guys or psychoanalytic guys. He's born in Vienna, Austria, so there's a big one right there. He was a medical doctor, psychiatrist, served during the war, during World War II. His experience is unique in that he was a prisoner in the concentration camps at Dachau and Auschwitz, and he lost his family in the concentration camps. So his view and his understanding of existentialism was shaped largely by his experience in concentration camps. And what he took away from his concentration camps, this probably tells more about him than it does existential theory. What he took away from his experience in the concentration camps, where he lost his entire family, immediate family, was that the will to create meaning and purpose is the prime human motivator. So where for Freud we have the psychosocial stuff, for Adler we have the maturity and autonomy stuff, Frankl has the will to create meaning and purpose as the prime human motivator. Clearly closer to Adler's view, right, than Freud's view, I would have to say. Frankl's primary topic, and there's a very famous book he wrote called Man's Search for Meaning. This slide, it kind of largely reiterates what I talked about on this slide just before. I think maybe the most interesting bullet on this slide is the fourth bullet down. Frankl said that even within the concentration camps, he found only two races or kinds of people, decent ones and unprincipled ones. Along those lines, he once remarked that the Statue of Liberty, which is obviously on the East Coast, should have a counterpart on the West Coast called the Statue of Responsibility. So Frankl would tell us that the small decisions that we make along the way to becoming either decent or unprincipled people, that these small choices are what make up our quest for meaning. And that mental health, well-being, anxiety, neurosis, all of those things stem from our relationship to our sense of meaning for our lives and life in general. One more note about Frankl from the previous slide. You'll notice in the demonstration video today that one of the Q&A people, his last name, it's Yalom's son. Never mind, scratch that. Moving on to Rollo May now. Rollo May, a contemporary of Frankl's, you'll see, born in 1909. Also influenced by the psychodynamic school, and particularly by the more positive perspective brought by Adler. Rollo May is largely credited with bringing the central ideas of existentialism to the United States. He started out looking at anxiety. The concept of social responsibility became a big idea for him. Here we're starting to see some of that Adler influence, right? Rollo May believed that neuroses, that unhealthy anxiety emerged from people's tendencies to avoid difficult conflicts and confrontations, and subsequently neglect the potential for meaning in their lives. So this avoidance of conflict and confrontation doesn't just refer to interpersonal conflict with other people. It refers to avoiding looking at difficult aspects of ourselves, at actively promoting a naive view of ourselves that doesn't incorporate the more difficult aspects of our personality. Rollo May and the rest of the existentialists would say that this type of kind of self-deception, this avoidance of conflict with the self, is going to be a major source for neurotic anxiety or unhealthy anxiety across the lifespan. He had his own developmental system, kind of reflects roots in the psychodynamic tradition, psychoanalytic tradition with the innocence, rebellion, decision, ordinary, creative. We're not going to talk too much about that right now. He had some important, influential books, especially again in terms of introducing these ideas to the United States. And that finally, again, we see that he incorporates a good deal of Adler's perspective in terms of focusing on positive aspects of human potential and our will and tendency towards self-fulfillment, self-actualization. So I started to misspeak a couple slides back about Yalom. You will see that one of the individuals who participates in the Q&A following our demonstration video this week, that his last name is Yalom. It's actually Irvin Yalom's son is in our demonstration video today. In the Q&A part, born in the United States in 1931 to a Jewish family. And there are a handful of ideas that Yalom really sums up digestibly that form kind of the almost the elevator speech version of existentialism and existential theory. So when I say elevator speech, it's the really quick version of what is it? What is existentialism? And what is existential therapy? So the overall goal is to help folks become authentic, and this journey to authenticity requires coming to terms with the basic aloneness inherent in human existence. And what they're talking about, what Yalom and other existentialists are talking about when they reference aloneness, is, I think of it as this way: we may be surrounded by people, even loving people, have meaningful social contact throughout our lives. At the very end, we do pass out of this world alone, right? So Yalom and the existentialists would want us to come to terms with the fact that on some very meaningful level, we are all here on the earth alone to some extent. So Yalom has 4 kind of big ideas or givens that are at the center of his understanding of an existential journey. We need to come to terms with the inevitability of death for ourselves and for all people that we love. We need to come to terms with the autonomy and responsibility inherent in the freedom that we all have as people, that we need to come to terms with ourselves as choice-making individuals. We need to come to terms with that aloneness that we talked about a second ago, that I talked about a second ago. And then we need to be able to make meaning of life despite these other components that seem to indicate that life doesn't have any inherent meaning, that it's our job to bring meaning. So maybe later thinkers here. Bugental, you'll see I won't say too much about. He will get to speak for himself in the video. He focuses a little bit on translating the ideas inherent in existential theory to interventions, kind of a how-to guy. So we have these ideas. How do we make this happen in therapy? You could see his core ideas, for example, the self in world system, how these ideas focus on the whole meaning-making concept as well. The idea that the ideas that each of us hold about who we are and how our world operates. What are the meanings of things? Clement von Tress. It's interesting because I've read a handful of Clement von Tress before. I haven't thought of him as an existentialist. I have thought of him as a very thoughtful writer who did a lot of his writings in the 60s and 70s. He's African American, and highly respected, important writer, contributing to the field at a time where there are not a lot of diverse voices in the field. So for me, that's how I've always thought of him. His primary importance is bringing an African American perspective to a literature that desperately needed it. Also, as indicated here, he's considered an important part of the existential movement in the United States. So some broad ideas here, and I think this probably comes across pretty clearly. Existentialism and even existential therapy, existential theory as it applies to therapy, really more of a philosophy than a structured treatment system, a perspective that we bring to therapy. There are probably very few people practicing who consider themselves as strict existential therapists, right? I feel like more what we can get out of existentialism for ourselves as counselors in training is how can these ideas inform my therapy, more so than we might get specific interventions, say with like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or something like that. Basic themes, I don't want to spend too much time repeating myself, but it's about making meaning in a world where meaning is not clear. It's about identifying and exploring universal issues that cause people existential angst, which is different from neurotic angst. We'll talk about that in just a second. And that through addressing these challenges, people, through addressing them with awareness, openness, and courage, people complete or further their emotional development so they become increasingly authentic. In terms of therapy, what it looks like and how it happens, I think you'll see in the Bugenthal tape pretty clearly that it hinges very much on the client-counselor relationship. I think you probably are also starting to see that existential therapy has a big influence on person-centered therapy, right? Keep that in mind as you watch the Bugenthal tape, or if you've already watched the Bugenthal tape, maybe think back on it and think about the parallels between Rogers and Bugenthal's version of existentialism. Again, there's these four kind of big areas or big ideas that are at the center of existentialism. We're all going to die, so our time on earth is finite. We are all in this world in one way or another alone, and that can cause loneliness that must be come to terms with, that we must come to terms with. There is no kind of prescripted meaning to life. Yes, different religious traditions do prescribe meaning. The existentialists would say, I think without debating the truth of any religions, that even there, with the religions, that's sort of separate from life. So we might turn to religion to find meaning for life, and that in fact would represent that life doesn't have meaning in and of itself inherently. Again, I'm not saying that's true or not true. I'm saying that's where the existentialists would be coming from on this. And then the freedom and responsibility part, that we are not victims of the world, that we are active participants, that we must make our own meaning. So in this system, there's a difference between existential anxiety and neurotic anxiety, right? So I've gone on a bit about the four ultimate concerns: the loneliness, death, the aloneness, death, meaninglessness of life, and responsibility. our relationship to these four ultimate concerns creates feelings of existential anxiety in everyone, and that's healthy in terms of existential theory. We should be concerned about that stuff. Those are the big questions that the world presents to us, that the very fact of being alive presents to us. So in an existentialist perspective, having an awareness about conflicts that we feel around death, aloneness, responsibility, etc., that's normal, that's healthy, that's orienting us towards self-actualization. Neurotic anxiety, on the other hand, it results from when we lack awareness of these things, of our physical world, our relationships, psychological world, and especially the four ultimate concerns. So what is this like, the source of neurotic anxiety for the existentialists? It lines up a little bit with denial, right? I mean, denial we tend to talk about usually in terms of being relative to a specific event. I'm in denial that I hurt someone or something like that. But the mechanism is very much the same in terms of I'm not going to look at that. I'm going to take things that make me uncomfortable and place them out of my sight, out of my mental sight, if you will. This, for the existentialists, would be the cause of neurotic anxiety, which is no longer a good thing. Again, reflecting growth out of psychoanalytic tradition, Frankl believed that neurotic difficulties and tendencies towards neurotic anxiety stem from overly harsh parenting. And we'll see this again and again in theoretical writings in terms of the impact of early development, and then also empirically, right? We know now that early childhood experiences and the relative health of those experiences definitely influence development across the lifespan. Now, each of the theories are going to have kind of specific ideas or more specific ideas about how that plays out specifically. So, for example, Frankl believed that it's overly harsh parents created a tendency towards that sort of avoidant thinking and neuroses that we've been talking about. And you see here these ideas in existential theory, really spread out to influence a range of different theories, some of which we'll talk about in great detail as we go on, some of which not as much. For example, a lot of the ideas inherent in existential therapy and existential theory make their way into narrative therapy, right? Narrative therapy is a therapy geared towards helping folks develop a story of their own life that makes sense to them and has meaning and is redemptive. This is an idea that has its birth in existential theory. So the existentialists would view our lives as a process of creating our own story, or our own history, as it says on the slide, with each choice that we make shaping and contributing to the next choice that we make. In this way, our time on earth, our lives, are not static. People, in terms of development, we are always developing. As we take on new challenges, put ourselves through difficult situations, maybe earning a master's degree, we have different and unique opportunities to engage the issues of life that contribute to meaning. This term, with the last bullet there, of Dasein, it's a German term. I actually don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly or not. It translates to English roughly as presence. Represents kind of a goal of existential therapy, and that is to be able to simultaneously live in the present, to be conscious of and take responsibility for making life meaningful, while also being aware that it is finite and it does end. Those are difficult questions to answer, right? Very challenging questions to answer. So in that way, we can see that the goals, the overreaching goals of existential therapy are pretty big, right? We might bring some of these ideas in when we're working with someone in a rehabilitation setting, but we are most likely not going to complete a course of existential therapy with someone. I mean a clinical course. I don't mean a course within our curriculum. So this quote from Tillich, we talked a little bit about Tillich earlier in the presentation. Interesting quote: "Man truly becomes human only at the moment of decision." So the idea here is, again, is that conscious awareness, that life responsibility. It's in the choices that we make our meaning of life. There's a lot of responsibility wrapped up in that. Existentialists would say we are not passive victims in life. That's can present challenges for people, for individuals, clients, patients. However, it's also kind of an exalted view of humanity, right? Every single person is an independent agent making their own decisions and charting their own course and making their own meaning. That's a difficult frame to move through, but I also think it's very empowering in terms of what it means to be a human being. In the primary ways that we're going to get further down the road in that direction is through awareness and authenticity. So, for existential therapists, existential theorists, the ideas of freedom and responsibility are essential. No matter what people's circumstances, there is a level of freedom and responsibility inherent in their being. So existentialists would really stay away from the idea of people as victims. Obviously, this isn't always going to work when someone has clearly been victimized. So we can see that a lot of the ideas relating to existentialism are going to be ideas that work best applied to a whole life and approach, right? If someone has been sexually assaulted and it's our job to provide immediate crisis counseling, we can think back to 668 over the summer, our job is to provide immediate crisis counseling. We probably aren't going to want to orient ourselves towards making sure this person understands that they're not a victim, right? We're talking more in a general sense. We're not victims overall of life. So that's an idea that we have to be careful about the way we bring it to people. I'd say maybe especially in rehab, because we'll find that people are seeing us when circumstances have really necessitated that they see us. So they very well may feel like victims at the time that they come to us, and we don't want to invalidate that. Nevertheless, stepping back and looking at the big picture, everyone has freedom and responsibility. Everyone is responsible for their own actualization. Everyone experiences confusion, agony, shame, defeat, anxiety, and goes through times where life seems absolutely meaningless. The existentialists would say, hey, you know what, that's okay and that's healthy, and that shows that you're aware of what's going on around you. And that it is our job to make meaning of the world and of our lives in spite of some of the influences that would say there is no meaning. And it's this journey, it's this developmental journey that makes us human. So for the existentialists, there's no kind of end point. We used that term Dasein earlier. That wouldn't be an end point, like, oh, you've reached Dasein, like someone might reach enlightenment. it's the journey in the process is where we would find our meaning in an existential framework. So following those ideas, the change process as it relates to existential therapy, the fundamental goal is going to be helping people find value, meaning, and purpose in their lives. I think probably it would have been better to say that the fundamental goal is to help people as they find value, meaning, and purpose in their lives, rather than kind of just serving it up to them. Support people and guide people to confront their deepest fears and anxieties. This may involve investigating clients' histories with them and help them see recurring themes where there have been barriers that have impeded their development towards an authentic and meaningful life. And then another goal, another kind of change, I don't want to say technique, but I'll go ahead and say change technique for existentialists would be to help people become increasingly aware of their freedom, of themselves as choice-making beings. So as we mentioned, the therapeutic relationship is a big part of this. We can think about Rogers, and it's very clear that the relationship is sort of where it's at for him. If we think back to the Gloria tapes, for existentialists, the relationship is also paramount, and that actually has a big influence on person-centered. However, they're less inclined than, say, Rogers, to hold back their own beliefs, values, in this sort of thing. So we would see in existentialism maybe a little bit more unrestrained sharing with the client. So whereas Rogers, if we think about Rogers and Gloria a lot of times says things to the effect of, boy, I wish you could just tell me what you thought about this. And you could see that Rogers will not do that, and he will never do that. Existentialists might be more comfortable with that, might be more comfortable saying, well, from my perspective, I see it as A, B, and C. Of course, you're going to have to make your own decision, but that is what I see. So then in this way, existential therapists are co-explorers with their clients. So whereas Rogers, I think you could think of Rogers and person-centered folks as being co-explorers, there's this maybe sense of being a little bit more removed from the process, whereas an existential therapist may participate more actively in helping folks identify answers and meanings. And they want to really be with their clients as fully as possible. And I think you'll see this, I really hope everyone watches the demonstration video. I think you'll see this in the Bugental video. The client is super interesting. You could see where she could be someone who might be sort of difficult to reach, but I think Bugental really conveys the relationship and his full presence with the client to such an extent that she's able to get a lot done just in the half-hour session or whatever that is videotaped. It's largely not going to be kind of a goal-oriented process. So again, we see that for those of us who are rehab-oriented folks, these are ideas that maybe we're going to bring into therapy, but we're probably not going to have a caseload of 100 people and be doing existential therapy with each of them as we develop their rehab plans, right? The process of discovery and that coming to awareness and authenticity is as important as the actual facts, or more important, with the focus being on the process and not the content. Talked a little bit about the I-thou relationship a few slides back. It's really about the therapeutic relationship and the mutual respect and intimacy inherent in the relationship. Another way that existentialism does not line up with rehab really well, it's not time limited. It is more aligned maybe with psychoanalytic in this way, it can go on for a very long time, right? It can be a very long period of an individual's life during which they're engaging in existential therapy and wrestling with kind of lifelong questions. Quite frankly, we don't see this kind of therapy happening as much as it once did. It probably was never really extremely common, but there was a time, probably 70s, mid 70s, until some changes in managed care really came to bear, where people would engage in long periods of therapy, of analysis, and of related types of therapy. Existential theory really comes out of that tradition in its true form. So probably none of us will be doing strict existential therapy. And there's not a lot of kind of mandated, manualized steps or stages. There's a very broad concept of 3 stages. It begins with the therapist gaining an understanding of their clients and where the client is in terms of their awareness and how they see themselves in the world. The middle phase of treatment hopefully allows people to use the information that they have shared and started to see, information that they have started to see as encompassing their sense of purpose, meaning, and value. And they take that information to develop and further develop purpose, meaning, and value. And then treatment moves on to this 3rd stage, and again, it's kind of vaguely defined when they can engage this process on their own, right? I said earlier, there isn't really a clear end point. That idea of descent doesn't represent when you graduate from existential therapy. There is no end point. But when folks get to the point that they can engage this journey by themselves, that would be when we would start thinking about termination. So while I said existential therapy is not a real kind of intervention-heavy theory, I do still stand by that. Yet there are some interventions that kind of grow out of existential theory that are pretty important. I'm actually going to talk about the last 2 first. So paradoxical intention is an interesting idea, and I looked at this in some other research that I had, some research of my own. Paradoxical intention is an exercise in it's almost like a self-driven exposure therapy, where people identify what they're most afraid of and what really their deepest, most secret, intense fears are. And then they work themselves up to where they wish for that to happen. And they try and bring that fear to fruition. Psychologically, we're talking more on a kind of imaginary, visualizing level. But through that process of becoming increasingly exposed to the thing or the idea of the thing that they are afraid of, the idea is that loses its power. And in fact, paradoxical intention is an idea that has gone outside of the bounds of existentialism and is considered as part of other frameworks as well. So just to kind of go back through and talk about the other bullets very briefly, existentialists will talk about being in the world. There are 3 modes of being: physical, interpersonal, and then the integration, the kind of overlap, if you think about it in terms of a Venn diagram, of being in the world and in the personal world together. The goal of existential therapy is to help folks kind of balance and align these three modes of being. If we jump down to the bottom bullet, the dereflection, I think that might maybe give us a little insight into the being in the world idea. Dereflection, as it's written out here, I'll just read it, takes the focus away from the person and helps them concentrate less on themselves and more on other people or goals they find meaningful. Reduces compulsive self-observation. So what are we talking about here? You've probably heard it said a lot more simply. Help folks get out of their heads, right? Help people get out of their heads. So, and we can see how that lines up with balancing these three modes of being in the physical world, being in the world of relationships, and being in the world of personal and psychological, where it is all synthesized. So, and then finally, I know I skipped around these sort of funny, if we look at the symbolic growth experience bullet, that's followed by conscious recognition and interpretation of the symbolic dimensions of an immediate experience leading to heightened awareness, discovery, meaning, and personal worth. Well, this could be something along the lines of completing your master's degree. You will probably, unless you're superhuman in some way, you will probably have some moments throughout your master's study where you think, what the heck is this? Why am I doing this? What worth is it? And how does it fit in with the world having any kind of meaning? And you might come up dry in terms of answers, right? It could be challenging at times. Well, when you're on the other side of this experience of earning your master's degree and having had confronted those elements, the dark night of the soul, if you will, well, that could be considered a symbolic growth experience, because through completing your master's degree, you ostensibly, at least in my example here, would have gained that heightened awareness. You would have discovered some meaning and developed some ideas about your personal worth as well. So this slide here is talking about framing out some of those ideas as they fit in Frankl's brand, if you will, of existential theory called logotherapy. I'm not actually going to go over all this right now. I feel like I'm going on a little bit long, and if you would like to look at this slide in more detail, or any of the other slides I kind of gloss over there, I refer you to the non-audio slides. You could go through those, move through those as slowly as you like, and you'll see that they're also referenced. So each slide has a citation, so if you wanted to look at anything more carefully, you could check out the original source material. How does existentialism play into rehab? Well, again, we're not going to probably be doing straight existential therapy, like a long course of it. However, there are some aspects that have been shown to be helpful in working with folks with disabilities. And this includes people with TBI, depression, chronic illness, severe disabilities, cancer patients, HIV, AIDS, substance abuse, communication disorders, etc. Well, how and why does this fit with rehab? Well, because as folks are going through these types of experiences, right? TBI, chronic illness, big life-changing experiences, their ability to address these experiences in terms of the overall meaning of life is going to make a difference in terms of outcome for them. And I don't mean in terms of remission where cancer is concerned, but I do mean in terms of being able to sustain a sense of meaning and dignity and humanity throughout very complicated crises. And ultimately, some of these existential perspectives are effective toward understanding the emotional issues that accompany various types of disabilities. I'm not going to talk about it here too much, but definitely existentialism and group therapy fits together a lot. So plant that idea in your mind, and when you're doing group with Dr. Glenn, I should probably check back with some students at some point to see if you all touch on existential at all. And I think here, when we talk about adjustment to disability, we can see where existentialism fits in really naturally, right? Life with disability presents people with all kinds of issues that confront their sense of freedom, that may further a sense of isolation, anxiety, may force them to confront death. Well, these are all the big ideas in existentialism too, right? Loss of freedom, stigma, the idea of finding worth and value in ourselves that transcends our physical abilities, our physical experience, our physical appearance. It allows us to see our value and worth as human beings on a deeper level, would be a goal of existential therapy, and therefore lends existential therapy to working with folks as they're adjusting to disabilities. Again, it's not going to help us develop a rehab plan necessarily in an immediate sense, but to have these ideas operating and informing the framework in which you do work with people, I think has a lot of benefits. So the critiques of existential therapy, I think you guys will probably be able to name these and lay these out on your own pretty easily. I don't know that I would say relying on a strong client clinician relationship is a limitation. I suppose it's a limitation if you have a hard time developing good relationships with your clients. I think probably more the explicit shortcomings would be the lack of structure or direction, lack of specific interventions, lengthy treatment, lack of empirical studies validating it. So what do these shortcomings sound a lot like? They sound a lot like shortcomings that have been identified for psychoanalytic theory and for almost all of these models of therapy that are really long kind of reflection, enlightenment based. They're tough to test empirically. They're tough to do in settings that are geared towards goal-oriented outcomes, and they're frankly tough to measure the progress that is achieved. I'd like to take a look at these last two bullets where they say lack of input from the female gender and lack of direction and concrete solutions being inappropriate for diverse individuals. So starting with the bottom one, lack of direction and concrete solutions make it particularly unsuitable for ethnic, racial minority clients seeking relief. Maybe yes and no. I like to be really careful about my assumptions around this area, and this is something that you'll see in multicultural literature a lot, and that is that, people from disaffected minorities have problems that are more immediate, and really they're not as inclined towards self-reflection and therapies that are geared just towards enlightenment. Enlightenment in terms of becoming aware of one's own issues. I am hesitant to sign off on that. I think it is important to be aware of where someone is, and if they have a hat on their head that is on fire, you don't want to start asking them about their early childhood. Nevertheless, I never want to assume, this person is a first-generation immigrant, comes from a poor family, definitely not going to be interested in insight-oriented therapy. To me, that doesn't seem like a good route to go. And actually, some people would say that, Clement von Trest, for example, would say that existentialism is an excellent frame for engaging with diverse people. It's probably going to be difficult to find data that tells you one way or the other. And similarly, lack of input from the female gender, while this would be true in the early development of existentialism, I would say that a lot of theories that have come subsequently or kind of around the same time do incorporate feminine wisdom. Existentialism lines up nicely with postmodernism. Postmodernism lines up nicely with feminist theory. So again here, yes, are the original writings of existential theory, can they be credited to white guys, old white guys? Yes, but a lot of those ideas also sprung up in other places. So I would want to be careful before I think, oh, well, since my client is female, or since my client is an ethnic or racial minority, I'm going to stay away from existential ideas. I don't agree with that necessarily. Nevertheless, the length of treatment, some of these other shortcomings are, in fact, drawbacks for rehabilitation. Apologize for the tangent there. The strengths, it's a philosophy. You can sprinkle it through your approach to therapy. It emphasizes a collaborative client-clinician relationship. It's holistic. It considers the whole person. It's not just a pathology-oriented theory. And it opens the door to incorporate spirituality for people that is going to be a good area to explore. Efficacy, I will just say, like as I mentioned, it's very difficult to test this type of theory and intervention. How can you just think from a research design standpoint, how do you effectively test a theory like existential theory or psychodynamic theory, where there's so many things going on? It's such a long course, very difficult to develop trials in effective research. Okay, I'm going to cut myself off there, click through the references here, and again, I will say to you all, feel free to go back through the non-audio slides. You can check out all of the references and resources as they're cited per slide. And have a great weekend. I hope to talk to you soon. Take care.